Just look at it. 3 red candles on crude oil. What does it mean and what are we going to do about this? Welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. And in this video I want to have a look at energy, more specifically crude oil. While I think crude oil still has some potential within the ongoing intermediate cycle, which so far is 86 days old, I think there is also a risk that crude oil is going to enter into the declining phase of this cycle. As I mentioned, the cycle is already 86 days old. Usually crude oil cycles last for around half a year or so. So we are already close to the midpoint, and it's questionable whether crude oil is going to give us a higher high anytime within the remainder of this ongoing intermediate cycle, or the cycle has topped. In my opinion, I think there is probably a 40% chance, so a pretty good chance, that the cycle has already topped. Although, as I mentioned, there is also a pretty good chance, I would give it perhaps a 60% chance, that after a bit of a cool down, perhaps crude oil might poke up again before going back down into the end of this ongoing intermediate cycle. And if that happens, say sometime into late July or even early August, that would give us a cycle that is perhaps a little bit short for a usual duration, but at least it would be perhaps similar in length compared to the previous cycle, which only lasted for 142 days. Usually, as I mentioned, these cycles last for about half a year. Why I think the intermediate cycle on crude oil might actually come in late July, early August is because that would actually match pretty well with the seasonality on crude oil. And let's have a look at that seasonality, although I don't often like to look at it, because as opposed to seasonality, I really prefer looking at cycles and market sentiment. But as you see on the seasonality chart, we see that July, although is usually green, it's still not the best month for crude oil, averaging less than 0.5% gains over the last decades. So if crude oil gives us a relatively short cycle, lasting for somewhere around 5 months rather than the usual 6 months, then a relatively mediocre performance in July will kind of match with crude oil seasonality. Looking at RSI has already been into overbought area back in mid-June, and the highest the 14-day RSI reached was 73.3. But again, looking at the previous cycle, we see that the RSI poked into oversold area, actually even a couple of times, before the intermediate cycle finally topped all the way closer to its right side of the cycle rather than the left side of the cycle. So as I mentioned, I think there is perhaps a 60% chance something similar happens, a bit of a cool off over the next, say, 2 to 3 weeks, before another poke above the Bollinger Bands will indicate that crude oil is really getting a little bit extended, perhaps reaching to the resistance zone I mentioned in one of my previous videos at about $74, $75. That's based on 2018 highs. And also, as I've mentioned, there is another scenario with, say, 40% chance where the bounce out of this consolidation doesn't create a higher high. And actually, whichever scenario plays out, with the intermediate cycle already close to its midpoint, I think it's time to get a little bit careful with crude oil and energy. So let's have a look at energy companies. XLE actually gave us a pretty big red candle yesterday. And while crude oil does not show any negative divergence on RSI versus the price, we do see this negative divergence on XLE. We see the chart has given us higher high on the prices. That's from mid-May to mid-June. But RSI is actually giving us lower highs, and that is a negative divergence, which often comes before some sort of a correction. So what I'm going to do with the members at myfinanceteacher.org is I'm going to take profits, meaning that I'm going to sell part of my positions in energy companies, in XLE, but I'm not going to sell all of the position yet. I will take another few days to ponder about that. And whether I will try to re-enter before the upcoming bounce, that is one more question I will also ponder, perhaps over the next week or so. Talking about things that you might want to ponder is whether potential decline into the correction in the general stock market, this is S&P 500 in front of you, might also affect energy negatively. The daily cycle on S&P 500 is 36 days old. Usually these cycles last for around a couple of months. We already see a few red candles on S&P, so perhaps S&P wants to come down into the short-term daily cycle low before bouncing one more time and then dropping into the intermediate cycle low. And this matching timing of the decline in the general stock market perhaps can actually weigh negatively on crude oil and energy. Besides, isn't there some saying about summer doldrums, summer dull time on the general stock market, which again perhaps will affect our energy companies? So that's what the charts are telling us. Next, let's move on to the market sentiment. And this is the crude oil optimism index in front of you. We see that a few days ago, this optimism index was pretty high, even slightly above 70 about a week ago. So while continued strength in crude oil, perhaps in the short term, is possible, what's also possible is a decline into an intermediate cycle low, perhaps over the next couple of months. So again, some caution is advised here. Look, this optimism just over the last couple of days has already dropped from nearly 70 to 63. And even then, it's still above the red line. It's still a little bit hot in the crude oil market. Next, let's have a look at the optimism index on XLE, the energy ETF. And as you see, it's really volatile, moving from the green line to the red line and back sometimes in just a couple of days. So what I add here is this green line, which is the 10-day moving average of this optimism index. We see that at the recent high in XLE, that's mid-May, this moving average came pretty close to the dotted red line, and the sentiment is now generally declining, again showing the risks of significant cool-off on the energy ETF. So if you have already seen some gains in this recent rally in XLE, all the way from mid-April, I think it's a good idea to reduce your positions, put some of those gains back into cash, and with the remaining smaller size of the position, you might see if XLE manages to make a higher high or not. And lastly, let's have a look at the COT reports, which disappointingly are not really telling me much, because looking at 2018-2019, we see some movement in the red and green lines. The red line representing commercial traders, which are often called smart money, and green line representing speculators, which are sometimes called the dumb money. But if you look at late 2020 and this year, the green and red lines are somewhat flatlining. There is almost no movement in these lines, which makes it quite difficult to make use of the COT reports at the moment. Hence, with me finishing with the video, it's time for you to share your opinion. Do you think that the economies opening up into the rest of summer will actually support energy companies and the price of crude oil into the rest of June and into July and August? Let me know what you think in the comments below. While you are there, please remember to hit that like button. I would really appreciate if you share the video with your friends as well. For now though, I wish you a pleasant day and good luck in your trades.